Okay, well, Manchester started in 1990 and they converted a heavy rail line into a light rail line. So in 1990 and then 1992 they built the system, and that's the way it basically stayed until about 2009 when we opened the new lines. But I mean, the work on that started in the mid-2000s. We did a lot of work on business case. What regeneration would bring to the Greater Manchester area, what areas needed to be regenerated, how that regeneration would happen, or where are the transport problems that the light rail could actually solve. So based on that, the whole plan was developed. Business cases were done on each line, not as an overall thing, but on each line, which was in accordance with the Department of Transport. And then obviously this funding started to grow from there, which of course is a big issue, is about where the funding comes from. And in Manchester at that time, in the UK at that time, most of the funding come from Department for Transport or government. However, they put in some guidelines, and some of it was that you had to raise some of your own funding. And some of that funding, there were certain guidelines on how you could raise that funding. Manchester decided that they were going to raise that funding through a congestion charge, a bit like London, and all that money from a congestion charge would go into public transport. So there was no sort of profit or anything like that. So it would do two things: obviously improve public transport, but also reduce congestion, which was quite high in a lot of the areas during the peak. What happened in Manchester is that a lot of the local politicians got cold feet. And so they decided to go to a referendum, and who would vote yes for a new tax. So it got defeated. So the powers to be in Greater Manchester got together and said, well, what are we going to do here? So to give them credit, from a political point of view, they're all from different parties, etc. They come up with what they call the Transport Fund. And so what that meant was it was like a top slice, if you like, it was 3% of the council tax. So all the 10 councils within Greater Manchester, they all committed for the next 7 or 8 years that 3% of the council tax would go into the Transport Fund, which would not just fund light rail, but would fund some road schemes, some bus schemes, etc., and even help some upgrade of some heavy rail custom facilities and things like that. So it was basically public transport, but the majority of the cost was going to the light rail. So of course with that, and also because we took revenue risk, as in the client or the government, then also we borrowed some money against the revenue on Metrolink. So there was one of the real problems is figuring out where all the funding is going to come from. Make sure you've got all that stacked away to make sure that you can take the project further to the next step. So one is obviously doing all the planning, the business case, make sure it stacks up, doing all the planning works, make sure you've got the funding. Once you've got all that, then you can work out how your procurement process is then going to take place. I think the Sydney and the Manchester thing are quite similar. Even though there's more street running here than there probably is in Manchester. However, the development of Manchester was obviously based on an existing system, which is 1990, very similar to this. We're going to put in a new line that's going to go out past Randwick and Central Station, etc. But it's also going to connect to an existing line. So you need to look at it as a whole thing, rather than here's an old line and here's a new line, because you want to make sure you don't divide the public. Is that whoever catches the new line with the new vehicles want to make sure they're not second-class citizens, and therefore they're being treated that way if they don't get the same facilities and the same. So there's a real balance to be had there. I think some of the real challenges is that I think a lot of people seem to think that putting in a light rail line is it's just like a road job. You just got to put some tracks down on the road. I completely disagree with that. I think a light rail line is an urban design project. It has a big impact on a lot of people. You go a couple of 100 metres and you've probably gone past 300 stakeholders, and every house or business, and George Street's obviously got big big companies and Myers and Pricewaterhouse, all this, and even AECOM's on George Street, etc. You know, so you have big companies, but it also goes past lots of people in their suburban streets, and you've got to treat all those people individually because they all have different requirements. And if you don't treat them as individuals, they will feel that they're being left out. So stakeholder management and informing all the stakeholders, etc., is absolute key. So it takes time to actually put the system in, and of course that's disruption. And of course people hate change, etc. So you need to manage people's expectations, and you need to inform people about exactly what's going on. And people will accept that. If people say that this is what's going to happen, but on a particular day, we're going to take this away on this particular day, then they're happy with that. It's when you don't tell them what's going on and they don't know, and then you tell them that it's going to come away this week and it's about 4 weeks later and it still hasn't come, then that's when people get irate, and that's when they will go to the papers and they'll go to their politicians, their local councillors, etc., and the whole thing just builds up momentum, and then what you're doing is firefighting all the way through the project because people start to lose confidence. And that's what you've got to work very hard to keep the confidence, because it'd be lovely to be able to click your fingers and say, here's a light rail system, it's there, it's in place, look how great it is. Because people do, once it's up and running, etc., it does start to bring the benefits that light rail does. I think integration is a big issue. One is integration for engineering, which people go, well, what does that really mean? But I think when you've got an old system and a new system, I think making them click together, work together, etc., is a big issue and a big challenge, because you're trying to try and run an existing system and you're trying to add another system on. And we've got to remember that some of the technology that was used on old systems is very different than what it is used today. As I've said to people before, it's like a Commodore 64 talking to an iPad, and it's very different. And so therefore it's a challenge in making sure that happens. But also I think integration is more from a customer point of view. If you think of a customer, is what does the customer do today and what will he do with light rail? And that integration with other modes of transport, public transport as in buses and trains, but also with cars and also pedestrians, is how does light rail integrate into the community to make sure that it actually connects to the rest of the community. So that is all part of integration, of getting people that the light rail is part of the complete fabric and not just a separate thing that's just being enforced on it. So integration, I think, is a big issue. Utilities, I think, is probably one of the big issues, and obviously Sydney and the government have gone to a lot of effort into trying to understand what utilities they've got, what they think needs to be shifted, and how they think that will take place. And it's all about the risk, about managing that risk. At the end of the day, if the risk is too high, it usually comes back to the client. So even though you think you're giving away the risk or handing over the risk and maybe paying for the risk, at the end of the day, everybody's in it together. And my attitude is that everybody's really got to work together, because there's always somebody in the room that can manage the utilities the best. You know, whether that's political pressure, whether that's talking to the managing directors of some of the utility companies, etc., or it's just working at the ground level. It's about joining together to make sure it can be done, because you are going to come across utilities that nobody knows about, and the question is, how do you deal with that? I think stakeholder relationships is huge. I think I've talked about that, but I think that all those sort of things have an impact on stakeholder, and I think you need to have close working relationships. The public need to talk to the same person. I think we all get a little annoyed about ringing up on the phone and talking to a voice message and leaving it, and then you've got no idea who you spoke to last time. I think you need to have face-to-face, you need to have local meetings, you need to know who the person is, and the person needs to know there, because then they understand the issue. So that's why it's such a large group. I think urban design is a very big issue. I think it's an urban design project, because at the end of the day, it fits within urban streets, it fits within the environment of the city, etc. So how is it going to look and how is it going to operate? It's not just about digging up a road, and that I think is a big issue. And it doesn't have to be expensive, but it needs to be really thought about on how it actually fits. In the construction, yes, the contractors will go through a safety mechanism, etc. But I also think even after it then starts to operate, because you're going to operate in an environment that people don't know. People aren't used to trams. So you've got safety on a tram, how do people work on and off a tram, etc. Because it's quite different than a train, etc. Because it's in a road environment, it can stop and quite suddenly, etc. So it's that, but it's also about how you actually move around a tram in an urban environment. In Manchester, we did a lot of communication and education with local schools, etc. You know, you've now got overhead lines, you've got poles, you've got trams that are running up and down. So how do you actually interface with that? I think you need to recognise who are the community groups, who are the people that are in the community that want to be involved in this. And so that is a bit of development work as you're developing the plan. And I think your plans can be fine-tuned by taking the community groups, the local leaders, etc. through all that, because they will have an opinion about what happens in the local area. But at the end of the day, the tram line is going to go down that street. It just depends on where is it going to go, how's it actually going to fit, and what's the best place for the stop, and how will the stop fit within the requirements. So that's all in the planning stage, and that's I've sort of been a bit flippant with that, because that is quite difficult, because people think that they want to have complete control over what happens. And yes, everybody will want it gold plated, and at the end of the day, it can't be gold plated, because that, you know, it's not good value for money. But you need to take into account some of the concerns, and a lot of the concerns is about traffic. You know, because the tram is no different than a bus. Really, it's running up and down the road, and it's going to take over some areas, etc. And it's all about what it's going to do to local traffic, whether I can turn, whether I can't, and whether people have still got access to their areas. And you know, you'd be amazed on if you went to people and said, well, we're going to ban a right turn from this road to this, but you can do it, you can get to another way. The impact that people will have about just of just one banned right turn, and that takes a lot of working through. Again, it's all about working with the local councils, the local leaders, etc., to demonstrate that it's best for the community to do that, because you won't get everybody to agree. And sometimes a lot of times you just need to push through that. As long as you obviously get the agreement at a higher level, you can't satisfy everybody. But then you need to recognise the people that aren't satisfied, and you need to inform them. I think one of the big things is you need to keep people informed. Is you've got to understand, sometimes I think we get into too much of solution mode, is work up what is the problem, what's the problem you're trying to solve. Whereas people are saying, oh, let's just put in a light rail. Well, I'm a light rail fan, I agree, but you've got to understand what you're doing it for, and is it the right time to put it in? Because light rail is very expensive, and I think that that's the big drawback, is to try and get the funding to put it in. Is it the right time? Is there other modes that you could put in and set yourself up that is, once you get to a certain stage, then you might come back and then look at light rail. So have some triggers that, you know, congestion might be too high, patronage might start to get too high, because all systems, it doesn't matter whether you put a bus system in it or even a tram system in, at some stage if it becomes too successful, you need to do something else, and maybe you need to change modes. So I think my advice is you've got to understand what you're actually doing for. So if you're doing it for regeneration, then that's what you're doing it for, and therefore, you know, how are you doing it so that it actually will regenerate? I'm an engineer by profession, but I really now, over the years, gradually changed it, that I'm really into the customer, and it's about being a customer and understanding the customer needs. And as I said before, is where are all the touch points of a customer, And do you think that that's the right thing? I think one of the most powerful things that I ever did in Manchester was I was a customer on the network all the time. And so when I went to public meetings, which were a lot of them, and people weren't happy with the reliability of the system, then you could relate to them, and you could say that yes, you didn't think that that was it was correct, and yes, we are working on that. And I think all the things that we do for a tram network and public transport, I think the most important thing from a customer point of view is they want it reliable. Part of Sydney is that they are going to connect into an existing system. The existing system is probably a little bit like a tourist tram at the moment. However, once it becomes part of a bigger network and people can actually move around from point A, point B, C, D and E, it will become a network. And therefore people will rely on it to be a network, and therefore the reliability of the old system will be just as important as the new system.